I have seen how others have overcome extreme pain, hardship. I realized that psychology can give me the tools. I have always been encouraged to find out that we can survive, we can thrive, can really become the best version of ourselves, even though pain was part of our journey.
I think we all go through trauma at some stage in our lives.
We need to get to know our signs of when we feel, for instance, a situation of stress. Do we feel our hands becoming sweaty? Do we feel we raise our voice? Do we feel our heart rate increases? What happens in that board meeting when we hear someone say something and we realize we're starting to be defensive? Emotions are really warning systems, like a neural alarm system. Something either of our past or our current is currently being triggered. We feel so threatened that we act in a certain way that we can freeze. So there's certain situations that our body's alarm system really senses what's going on.
How does that affect someone in leadership?
The skill for these leaders will have to be to note what happens before they express.
Why should we see a psychologist? Welcome our viewers and all listeners to another amazing episode of Mindfulness TV. Today we are really fortunate and privileged to have in our presence the learned and the wonderful Dr. Cecile Le Roux. Welcome, Cecile.
Hello, Dion.
How are you?
Thank you for having me. I am so good.
It's an absolute pleasure. I'll tell our viewers again, if you haven't known about who Dr. Cecile is, let me tell you a little bit about her. She is originally from South Africa, where she studied in South Africa. She studied in Canada. She has studied in Sydney. And she has worked with leaders and entrepreneurs and students all over the world. She also researched and has a PhD in
psychology, specifically in the coaching psychology unit from the University of Sydney. But my topic was personal transformation in the workplace.
Amazing.
Yes.
There you go. Welcome, Cecile.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure.
So
Dion.
looking forward to this.
Same here. Let's get going.
So, Cecile, what has been your passion that has led you into the space of psychology?
Yeah.
What was that driving passion? Because whenever I talk to you, the one thing I always get is passion, and I love that because you're passionate about what you do.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't have any passion to do it. And it's the drive. It's that wanting to get up and do it every day. What has been your passion that has driven you into this whole psychology and coaching space?
Absolutely. You know what? That passion is really because I have seen how others have overcome extreme pain, hardship, and we can use the word trauma. And I have always been encouraged to find out that we can survive, we can thrive, and we can really become a best version of ourselves, even though pain was part of our journey. And so because I've seen that, because as a young person, I observed that, and I was really encouraged that it is able to do that. And because of that, I was driven to bring hope in whichever capacity. And that sense of how we can help others to grow and thrive is really because ultimately the biggest ingredients that help others to survive is when they have hope. And so I realized that psychology can give me the tools to actually help to create nurturing environments and learn strategies that help others to have that sense of hope, rekindle perhaps some purposes and some fires that were not burning as bright anymore. And that really is what pulls the spirit through hard times. And so I was really, really curious about how can we be really better at how we bring people to them forward in their life.
I know that you're really learned in the field of personal transformation after trauma, which I think it's so relevant. I think it's all around us. I think we all go through trauma at some stage in our lives, at whatever scale that is. But I want to first delve a little bit into emotional wellness, because I think the state of mind that you're in controls, everything else. just it depends how motivated, your drive, all of those things. But to yourself and generally in terms of psychology, what is emotional wellness? We use self-development, we use all the selves, but emotional wellness, for people that are listening out there, what does it actually mean to someone?
Absolutely. That is a great question. And I think, Dion, you're right that there's also a lot of ideas and a lot of theories, and it can be very confusing for people to actually land at what it really means. Underneath the surface, if you put all of that together, there are so many frameworks, and I'm happy to share some examples shortly. But I think what is underneath the surface, it's about being and functioning well. However we define our wellness, but it is about being and functioning well. Emotional wellness is that idea that our emotions is something that we can manage and that we befriend and that we tend to, in a way, not to let that drive us in negative ways, but in positive ways. So in other words, we see emotions as being a part of who we are, but not controlling who we are.
That is the thing, to be able to control your emotions. You have an argument or you're dealing with a certain decision or an outcome. And this is the thing, right? Whether you're wired, whether it's a framework of your upbringing or whatever it is, or your coping mechanisms.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's why I think it's hard work and it's brave work to take that on, is to really sit with our own emotions and to befriend them really and understand them and get to know them. Emotions are really warning systems. It's our body's emotional, like a neural alarm system. It's an alarm system that tells us something either of our past or our current is currently being triggered, is sort of a word we use. In other words, it brings up something that we have experienced before that might have been a pattern that we see our parents or colleagues use, or we've had experiences that help us to suddenly be withdrawing because we need to feel safe, or we need to act out because we need to actually defend ourselves, or we feel so threatened that we act in a certain way that we can freeze. So there's certain situations that our body's alarm system really senses what's going on, and deep down, these emotions pop up. But the word control is really one that we need to change to compassionately meet our emotions instead, because they really send us warning signs. And then it's about us noting that, but not letting that dictate the external behavior, the shouting happen or...
See, that is so, it's easier said than done. It's amazing that it's not you. You're not that person. You know that you're a good person. You're not wired that way, right? But if you're in an argument, or for whatever that is, whatever transition, human transition, transaction it is, whether it's a conversation, etc., and then you go from one extreme to the next, and you could say the most vicious things, not intentionally, just either whether it's protection or you wanna, you know what I mean. And then when you take a step back, you go, that's not me. I didn't mean to say that. I didn't mean to do that. But the outcomes can be catastrophic to the other person. All of a sudden, you could have broken trust. You could have acted in a way that's not you. And I find when speaking to friends or speaking to people, I find this. Why should we see a therapist? Why should we see a psychologist? Because when we are put in those situations again, are we going to be able to control it? What are they going to do for us that we can't do ourselves? You know what I mean? And these decisions, these emotions, these effects that happen with people, happen to presidents, happens to CEOs, happens to students, happens to entrepreneurs, happens to husbands, happens to fathers, happens to teachers, happens to doctors, everyone and anyone.
Absolutely.
It's one that I guess it also comes down to the individual. And I guess today we want to say to these people and to everyone, including myself, that you can take control of your emotions if you get the right help, like yourself. So, in dealing with emotional and wellness, let's talk about how does that affect someone in leadership? Because to make good decisions, you have to be calm. You have to make sure you have all the relevant information and da da da. And so, from all these different sectors, including the health sector, including CEOs and corporates, yeah, how do you work in terms of the framework of leadership and psychology with these clients of yours?
Yes, absolutely, Dion. That is so well framed. And what I like about what you said just then is that leaders are not exempted from this experience, right? And so, if we had the privilege earlier in our life to do the personal development work, to really look at which situations, which people really get our emotions triggered in a certain way, that will be helpful as we move and climb the corporate ladder. However, not all of us had the privilege to do that or necessarily the need to do that earlier on. So sometimes we are also, when you get in a position of a leader, you're typically a high performer, which means you also learned how to overcome setbacks and all sorts of things early on in your life. And you plow through and you reach the top without having had to do some of the deeper work necessarily.
Absolutely.
So now you are there, and now you have to work hard at being that leader who sets an example for others, but also not let your emotions, so to speak, control you. Now, the thing about emotions, again, is to see them as a friend and to treat them as something that sends you a warning sign. But the skill for these leaders will have to be to note what happens before they express what that emotion wants them to do. And so that comes down to being extremely aware of what goes on internally for us. We need to get to know our signs of when we feel, for instance, a situation of stress. Do we feel our hands becoming sweaty? Do we feel we raise our voice? Do we feel our heart rate increases? What happens in that board meeting when we hear someone say something and we realize we're starting to be defensive? So we have to do the self-awareness work to train ourselves to recognize our own signs. It's very, very, very micro level work. But we learn, and that's what a psychologist or a coach can help you to do, is to zone in on those moments, to start to recognize your own pattern, because we have patterns, how we usually respond. And what are our patterns so we can catch ourselves, be our own detectives, to catch ourselves sooner, to then pause before we act. And that's the secret. You know, there was a New York Times article a few years ago, and on the cover, this new word made its appearance, which some of the listeners may have heard, and it's called mindfulness. And mindfulness was described as the silver bullet for leaders.
The silver bullet.
The silver bullet for leaders. So it is that skill to be really aware of what is happening in the present moment, being very, very aware, and then non-judgmentally meet whatever is coming up for us. In other words, what is our mind and our heart and our body sort of full of in that moment? That's what mindfulness really is about. If we can grow that capacity to be so aware in the moment, that when we feel emotionally triggered in some way or emotionally stirred up, where we realize our emotions is not in green anymore, but it starts to go up to orange or to red, that's when we need to be present. And that's when we need to identify which strategies work for us personally, because every person is different. It might be about taking your deep breaths. It might be about standing up, taking 5 minutes and come back. But there's a process to identify which strategies work for you in those moments, to just make sure that if you've been emotionally charged up, to come back down to a sort of a green space.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue for us to talk about your circle of leadership course that you run.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about that. And
Yeah.
I guess the other things that really intrigued about, what's been your findings from dealing with, different scales and different sectors of people?
So the absolutely, I'll tell you a little bit more because it's important for leaders to know that they're not alone. And often we think that the journey is something we need to, again, continue to be the smartest and the wisest, and we need to know how to manage ourselves. But when leaders get to a point where they realize, actually, I can make myself even better and equip myself in all unique ways to continue to advance and shine.
1 second.
Yes.
Before I lose my line of thought.
Yes, go.
So not only do I want to know more, and for our viewers and people that are listening to this podcast, you've got leaders at different phases, right? You've got leaders that are entering, right, into the sector. You've got leaders that have been there for many, many years. So you've got leaders that are really positively charged, ambitious, ready to embrace whatever the challenges are. And then you've got other leaders that are being there, been through different transformations, and now probably just a little bit tired, being on the hamster wheel, loss of freaking connection, or probably loss of drive, right? And sometimes on these different scales, if you towards the end you go, I'm either tired of doing this. Can I reinvent myself again? Technology is changing. The way we do things are changing. For example, AI is in. All of this, can I embrace it? Can I conform? Do I have the skills? Do I have the emotional appetite to get up and go again? And that to me is the fascinating part.
That is so fascinating. And Dion, I'm so glad you picked up on that because that is exactly why leadership is not a one-day event. It is a process. If we look at all the different theories and definitions and frameworks, the current very popular way of looking at leadership is it's a process of influencing others to achieve a common goal. And so this process means it's alive. It constantly changes. You never stop being a leader, and you're not a leader just one day or for one event or one project, right? And so across our journeys, also the shape and expression of our leadership style and the way we work changes and the way we lead changes. And so what's interesting in what you said is that when you are younger and you start off, you have certain things you focus on as a leader that is important. For instance, perhaps you are focusing on your presence as a leader to be more assertive and to make sure that you're more visible. Later on, you want to become less visible and you want to take more of a back seat and more of an empowering style. So you actually encourage others to be a little bit more visible because you don't necessarily need that anymore. And so across our journey as adults, we go through these beautiful cognitive changes that actually help us to change the way we look at the world and what we need from the world in terms of who is the authority figures and the voices that we listen to. Often it starts off being external and then it goes to a little bit more of an internal place and we define our own ways of what success is and what leadership is. And then later on we become quite self-transforming where we get to a point of really dissolving kind of who we are so that the initiative or the group or the cause that we're interested in is actually advanced. And so that's why leaders constantly, they keep on growing and changing as well. And specifically, sometimes we find that these changes happen when the world around them shake them up. So it could either be a restructure, or it could either be now we go through a merger and acquisition, and now there's new roles, and we need to define who we are and what we do. So it could be external. It could also be in your personal life. There might be a divorce, or, somebody passes away, and suddenly that shakes you up. And so these are opportunities to pause and change, but it could be very subtle as well. You just notice, I'm just not interested in this anymore, or it doesn't bring me the joy I have. Now, these leaders need to find out, is that because they're burned out, or is it because they're actually going through an opportunity to transition into a new way of expressing their leadership? And that is really, it's so important to listen to those voices because it might mean that they have a new purpose.
Let's talk about those voices, Cecile. What is the common feedback or questions that you get asked?
Yeah. So often it's about, I just don't get the same joy out of what I've done before.
So true.
Yeah. And, or, you know what? This just feels like the same old, but I just don't know why I'm getting up in the morning anymore. Like, I just feels like I'm living someone else's life. Like the suit that I'm wearing is just not mine anymore. You know, there's a sense of discomfort. There's also, it's so important to really look at where this is coming from. Again,
And you feel stuck, right?
you feel totally stuck.
You feel that
Yes.
you don't have the capacity anymore, the drive.
Yes. The drive is down. So your desire is down. Your drive is down. Your energy typically is also down because you don't know where to push your energy towards. So that's typically the same thing is conversations with colleagues. They feel very hollow and they feel like, oh, why are we doing this? And your capacity to mentor others just kind of start to go. You know, you don't have the same, I don't have time for this, or should I really go for, with this junior new colleague, and have a coffee with them. So you start to lose, the things that brought you joy and meaning and purpose in your role is starting to change. Again, it's important to make sure that there's not other underlying things, such as anxiety, or sometimes even if life, brings about really big changes, depression can come through.
So the circle of leadership,
yes,
it addresses.
Yeah. So the leadership circle in particular, yes, absolutely. I love the circle of leadership. That's such a nice name. We have to brand. No, we have to bring that in. I love
leadership
that.
Circle.
Yes,
right.
yes. So the leadership circle specifically is a product that helps leaders to go through the journey of self-discovery, where they really discover when their sense of purpose have changed. Why is that? And what I really love about this process and the work with the leadership circle, and I'll say a little bit more about just to give you some practical kind of insight into what that is. But the reason why this is helpful is it is not like other tools that typically either point out what's wrong with someone or where the gaps are, but it also points towards where the potential is. So the leadership circle can either be an individual process or a 360-degree feedback process where you get about 10 plus others, up to about 20 or even more others, to rate what they see in you as a leader. And it goes through a process of identifying you in terms of what dimensions you feel you are showing towards others, as well as what others are seeing in you. And then it creates an outcome and a report that really visually demonstrates what are your operating sort of mechanisms underneath the surface that usually gets triggered, if we use this word trigger again from before, that triggers you. And examples there could be either when you are very complying, and this is now not complying in terms of, governance, but this is more about giving in to others and really because their opinion you feel matters more than what you as a leader need to express. So sense of, let's say, complying. There's a sense of being very protective. What are you protecting? So it comes from an unhealthy place of I'm feeling scared or threatened in some way. Or, for instance, a sense of controlling. And those are three very strong dynamics that usually gets, driving us to react instead of being responsive mindfully and really evaluating what our emotions are. And then what I really enjoy about this tool is it then also shows you where do you sit in terms of your potential to be creative. So this is about how much authenticity do you have? How much achievement do you currently show? What about your relational skills? How is that? How about your self-awareness? How about your systems awareness? So it takes you into a realm of identifying what your potential areas are that pushes you forward, as well as what keeps and holds you back. And so you can work both on kind of the hooks that kind of hook you to hold you back, as well as gives you a map to move forward. So it's a very comprehensive tool
what about students,
Yes.
that have potential, or, you know, going through university or school, etc., where you have goals, and you want to achieve, etc. And sometimes it can be daunting. Sometimes you can lose your self-esteem. Sometimes you can feel you're on a hamster wheel. Sometimes, you know what I mean?
Students are in such a privileged position because they have given themselves the permission to learn and grow. Whether it's a mature student that comes back to do a diploma or a certain course, or whether it is a full-time student, we can be starting at our younger years. Often students are typically undergraduate university students. This age of between 18 and 23 is an incredibly difficult time in terms of forming who you are. It is the most difficult time to really sit and take time to reflect, about what your decisions are, how your studies will influence the choices you make later, etc. So it is the best time to really partner with psychologists, counselors, coaches to
I
really
love
dive
what
in.
you said once on one of your previous kind of chats where, you said, I love for students to realize their potential, but to realize their potential, they need the environment, they need the sunshine, they need the water, they need all of those ingredients that is going to bring out their potential. So for students that are listening out there that want to incorporate some good tools or some techniques, etc., to help them go forward, what do you suggest?
So, especially if these students, whatever journey they're on, if they want to become leaders, I would highly recommend them definitely do what I'll suggest in a second. Even if they don't want to become leaders, they, in terms of corporate or formal sort of having official titles as leaders, they will be self leaders. They will always lead themselves. They will always lead their families. They will always lead whichever workspace they're going to occupy. So, leadership and making sure you have the right tools for life is 100% applicable to everyone, no matter what you desire in terms of your journey. So, that's to let all students know it's applicable to all students. It's about really making sure that you create time weekly for critical self reflection. I always, in my courses, I always bake that into the course outlines in terms of some of the learning outcomes that students needed to learn, that they need to really pause and reflect in terms of how what they're learning can apply to them personally. Now, this might be relevant for some courses that it's easy to do with a content such as psychology or culture or organizational behavior and other courses. But it can also be other courses where the topic is quite foreign from where and how you live. Then it's about the experiences. So it's about taking the experiences of, for instance, your discipline to study. It is your response when you get your grades back and you're not happy. It's about what that fellow student told you while you were working on your group project, or what that faculty member said in terms of the feedback you got, and you were really hurt by that. So it's about using all these opportunities to pause and reflect. And again, I would highly recommend partnering with somebody, either a coach or a psychologist, to really dig deep and use these opportunities to kind of training for reigning, to really find out what is it that you can train and learn, to get strategies, to manage your emotions, get to know them. And specifically, usually students have a desire to be high performers. They want to be high achievers. And typically, that means they put a whole lot of pressure on themselves. And there's so many, things we can talk about the pressure that students put on themselves. But it's about learning what is your stress response. And then
So good, your
finding
stress
out.
response.
Yes, exactly, naturally. And don't judge yourself for having that, because it's there for a reason, and it represents either nurture or nature or a combination of both, typically a combination of both. And that's okay. But what is not okay is if we ignore our patterns and just kind of push through life without evaluating.
Being mundane, yeah?
Yes, exactly. Without evaluating and getting
So
strategies.
what about leaders in the healthcare sector, connection, patients and your team and stuff like
Oh,
that?
amazing. Thank you for that question, Dion. It is so important because, again, we know typically healthcare professionals are those who have had deep sense of callings to do work that they really care, or they were really just attracted to the industry for whatever reason. And so they had to work really hard to get where they are. And typically they're great at self-discipline, they're great at pushing through, they're great at being resilient and persevering. What they're not as good at is to face the internal things that go on, and that often gets kind of, educated out of us and pushed back because we need to be strong. You need to be the authority figure in the room, so you can't show vulnerability. You can't use shame. You can't show that you don't know. And that often is actually where we need to really pause and make sure that we look at what goes on internally. Medical professionals, as well as other allied health and all sorts of healthcare professionals, are really, really good at being strong and putting up a facade. And we call that emotional labor, which means you work really hard at showing up in a way that might not be who you are deep
I like
down.
that, emotional labor.
Yeah, that's a term. The viewers need to go and look it up. And it really can be quite damaging and easily lead to burnout if you continuously do that over time. And so what we need to do, is really, especially for folks who work in the healthcare industry, is to make sure that they look intrapersonally. Intra means inside of you, as well as interpersonally. What about your relationships with others? Often your personal relationships, your partners, your spouses, your kids, your family, if they are whole and if you've done the work to connect with them, that usually is a great point to start. The people around you.
That's right, your support.
Yes, in terms of learning how to connect with others, and then you can bring those connections into the workplace. Patients can sense whether or not you are truly there. If you're absent and if you feel hollow inside, if you feel you're just showing up because you're doing a job,
connection, right?
Absolutely. You need to go and find out, why are you not feeling that connection? Why is that not there? Now, we know the healthcare system does not allow you to necessarily go there because of time constraints, et cetera, and other very intricate and complex variables. But if you can grow, something and some kind of skill set to just have 1 or 2 minutes of showing empathy, listening to a patient. There's so much research that just talks about empathy in that relationship of healing at the end of the day. That goes further than any script you can provide them. Of course, it's more complex than that.
Like they say, listening is an art.
There you go. It's an art, but it is so helpful to be valued and to be heard. And that goes very, very, very far.
I guess that brings us to this fascinating topic too for myself personally is talking about personal transformation after trauma. And, trauma is so wide in terms of what could be traumatic and what is traumatic and different levels of traumatic, being traumatized. I'd like to talk on both spectrums, both ends of the scale, so to speak. Let's just start with, someone that's been abused, a rape victim, someone being through a divorce, or that level of trauma, to something that you could enlighten us about. It's more like if there is a lighter form of trauma, and working your way back, your self-esteem, your confidence, getting over the fear factor, being able to get back into society again, into your relationships and maintain those, because I can only imagine what that would be for someone. And then there's the other side where someone has been through that kind of trauma, has never spoken about it, and has just carried on life, not knowing that that's there, hasn't been addressed, and what it's actually doing for them.
Absolutely. It's, Dion, that is at the core of so much. And you have absolutely nailed it on the head to say that trauma is very, very individualistic. It's something that it's relative to any person's experience. It's one person can experience trauma and not function the moment after. Someone else can, and they probably go throughout life until it comes back. Something reminds them of what happens way later in life. And they go perhaps through their own journeys. It was a childhood trauma. Now they have their own children and they're starting to notice that they need to address it now because they cannot carry that any longer. And so usually what we find is that professionals who have really been able to be strong and be, have successful careers have learned the art of really concealing that and pushing through without addressing it. And it is important to, when you start to notice that something is off, go and address it, because then it's time for that to be processed. It's time to revisit that. It's time to reprogram what happened in certain ways. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the problem. That's what happens with the breakdown between people. That's what happens when we just start to live life as kind of robots, and there's absolute no sense of meaning and purpose in what we do. Our emotional well-being is suffering because we're not wholly ourselves. And we are acting in ways that are not necessarily healthy for others as well as for ourselves. We can't perform anymore. We can't deliver anymore. We don't care anymore. And so we start to see that these subtle signs are there until it really becomes extremely bad. And that's when, we can either have extreme expressions of that with PTSD and other kind of signs that can kind of show up that tells people that they have, recurring nightmares and other things. Or it can be very subtle. It can be anxiety because their nervous system have never recovered or were overstimulated at a time when an emotional event happened. And so that becomes their new normal. And they didn't realize that this overactive nervous system is actually responding to the threat that they've had when they were young. And now or earlier on, or as adults, something happened. And that has become their new normal. But it interferes with their functionality.
And it's just not normal.
It's not normal.
Because then that's your defense mechanisms.
Exactly. Yes.
Compromised, right?
It's compromised, and it comes out in your relationships. It comes out in how you work. If you push yourself too hard, why are you pushing yourself too hard? Could it be because something happened before and you try to earn your worth? You try to prove yourself. You try to create, some kind of presence for yourself in the world because you never had that.
What happens when you actually address it then?
Yes, and that's where the beauty lies. If we can, the gift, the scars can ultimately become our stars. They can really help us to move forward in exponential ways if we take the time to stop and look at it. First of all, it's about healing and really meeting that with compassion so that we can understand. Often we don't necessarily see a logical explanation for what happened, but it's about revisiting that, making it object, taking it from a place in our brain where it was stored to a different place in our brain. We can actually make sense of it and look at it more objectively and holding it differently.
And so once you address it, or you speak to a therapist, or you speak to a psychologist like yourself, or someone like yourself that's actually done a lot of research in this and so well versed in this, is that after you address it, you start to live a better life. Your coping mechanisms, the actual individual, then it changes a lot of how you actually address and deal with situations, right? And that enhances the quality of your life, your relationship with your spouse, other relationships with kids, loved ones, etc.
Absolutely. And colleagues.
And colleagues, yeah.
It comes out in ways that we are overcritical as bosses, or that we become so critical of ourselves when we make errors or the smallest little things that we do wrong, and we become highly judgmental of ourselves. And so it really comes out anyway, but you definitely see it in your personal relationships as well. And that's what's so scary, if we don't revisit that. But if we do, which is where your question was just then in your lovely reflection, Dion, is if we do, it becomes a gift. And it is true that we're all on this earth and we do experience pain. All of us do. All of us, none of us are exempt of that sense of suffering on this planet. So, but it is our responsibility to do something with that. And it is our responsibility to really make sure that we look at what it is that we need to attend to so that we can move forward and discover our potential and not let that hinder us and hold us back, but let that become our strength that really propels us forward.
Awesome.
Yeah.
We could go on for another hour, but
Oh, we can.
I just want to
Yes.
thank you so much, and also just finishing up on personal development and after trauma, etc.
Yes.
Is that there's no shame.
No, absolutely not.
There's once you address these sorts of things, it really enhances your quality of life.
It does. It does. And in fact, Dion, just on that, I want to share with you a term that the listeners might want to go and look up is there's fantastic research on a term called post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth, PTG, is a phenomena that the positive psychology movement started to research. And I jumped on that and I looked at positive trauma, where trauma can happen.
Positive trauma.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
And it's really about taking the trauma that we experience and making sure that we take the best from that situation and process it and use it to move us forward. But what's interesting with post-traumatic growth in terms of what you just said then is that, in fact, people end up being not just returning to baseline after trauma, but they extend and expand that, and they absolutely go further, and their life becomes more meaningful if they do take the time to process trauma. So it really is an opportunity to launch people into a whole new way of being after they've been, post-traumatic growth, to be better off, than before the trauma, if you compare it to pre-trauma experiences as a baseline.
Wow. I learned something today. That is for sure.
Yes, for sure.
Cecile, thank you again. It's been absolutely awesome, very enlightening as well. And
Wonderful.
we definitely would love to have you back on the podcast. And for all our viewers out there and the listeners out there, if you want to know more and you want more information and you want to make contact with Dr. Cecile, all the information and the details will be listed below. So from myself today and from Dr. Cecile, thank you for listening and thank you for making a change. We'll be back next week with another episode of MedCenters TV. Remember, only you can make a difference. Bye for now.